Shogun has now come to a conclusion, and it was a show in which I was concerned about whether they would land safely. Every episode of this show was really fantastic to see, from the plot's establishment and development within the first 45 minutes to a result and a fatal death, which would frequently occur in the final 15. It always left you in a state of astonishment at what you had just experienced, and it left you wanting more. With the completion of the final episode and the knowledge that there would only be one season, the show was unable to replicate what it had done in the previous 9 episodes. It needed to deliver a closure and bring an end to the story that we'd all been so invested in over the last 6 months, and I believe they completely nailed it. So with that, let's watch the video and talk about why Shogun's finale is excellent. Just so you know, this video will include spoilers. The emotion that was present this episode elicited more emotion than most others. The tempo and tone of this final episode contributed significantly to the sense that the end was near. Mariko's death seemed to loom over the episode, affecting all of the characters in unique ways. Something that then permeated the general feeling, which I believe is precisely what the show was striving for. The scene in which Mariko's space was unoccupied, where she typically sat with John and Fujii, was a sad one. Toranaga was thinking of Mariko's sacrifice. Father Martin Alvito mourned Mariko in his own way. Even Mariko's actions after her death, such as forging a bargain with the church to allow Blackthorne to live and not be executed, demonstrated that even though she was gone, she was still there. It felt decisive in its approach, which I believe contributed to the episode's high emotional tone. We become close to Mariko over the course of the 9 episodes, and this was the first one she wasn't in. And I feel like we were all mourning her along with the characters. Furthermore, John's dream in which he was holding her cross and crying as he left Osaka because he missed Mariko, as well as his transformative mindset in not viewing the people of Japan as savages as when he first arrived, demonstrated progress and allowed us to feel what he was feeling at the time. When the 2 children asked him about Mariko, it revealed that John had changed and that his perspective had shifted dramatically since his arrival in Japan all those years ago. I also consider the fact that there was a scene in this final episode where Omi and John were respectful to one another and showed each other respect, as opposed to the previous episodes, which included fury, animosity, and threatening conduct. It demonstrated John and Omi's progress, as well as Toda Bentero's admiration for John and assistance in pulling the Erasmus II. It demonstrated that feelings had been set aside, and John was still as much a part of them. He was no longer perceived as a barbarian, and the people there were no longer regarded as savages. All of these moments, albeit being minor and inconspicuous, contributed to the overall tone of the episode, and they truly marked the character's journey. John and Fujii's connection evoked a wide range of emotions. You could tell John was disoriented after losing Mariko, and Fujii restored some of his familiarity when he returned to Ajiro. However, when he learned that she was leaving to become a nun, he was quite unhappy. The fact that he helped her move on from the deaths of her husband and child, and she helped him get over Mariko's death, as well as him dropping the cross into the river, which symbolized his transition. The fusion of the 2 cultures at that point, with him remarking, "A soul committed to the sea is one that lives forever." The way they were together in that moment was simply amazing. The score for many of these heartbreaking situations was also great. The instrumentation, the sense that the music simply moved with the scenes. The music climaxed when emotion was at its greatest, which was most noticeable in the scene while John was leaving Osaka, or just at the conclusion when the camera was traveling around Toranaga and suddenly cut to darkness with Shogun emerging on screen. Audio and visuals worked wonders in this final episode, adding to the dramatic, conclusive sense. Yabushige's demise. Yabushige was a figure that I believe we all like to despise, or perhaps loathe the fact that we adored. He was a complete fool, but you could tell he was desperate to survive, and that was all he wanted. As a result, he betrayed both Ishido and Toranaga simultaneously. His actions of acting against one and providing information with the other usually seemed pretty harmless. However, due to his involvement in allowing the shinobi into Osaka Castle, which ultimately led to Mariko's death, Toranaga forced him to do seppuku. I found it quite poetic that he spent all his time throughout the series trying to survive, when in reality, if he had have just picked a side and not drifted between the both of them, then he would have survived, and most likely not met the death that he so desperately wanted to avoid. I thought the sequence in which Yabushige begged Blackthorne to accompany him to England was also wonderfully poetic. The fact that in the first episode, John was begging Yabushige for his life, and now the roles had been turned, signified a complete journey for each of them and showed how much had changed. I also thought that when Yabushige was on the verge of death and asked Toranaga to inform him about his plan, it demonstrated Toranaga's lack of trust in him. Marika was involved and informed. Hiramatsu read Toranaga and determined what needed to be done, and even Nagakata was thanked by Toranaga after his death, implying that it bought him time. Yabushige, however, was never to be trusted, no matter how long the two had known each other. However, he was essential to Toranaga's scheme, which I find astounding. Toranaga had to account for Yabushige's betrayal, and like he predicted, he did. So the character's call was true from the moment that the episode started and finished. There was also a few moments in the finale which tied back to earlier episodes as well, such as within his poem he mentioned how he didn't want to be burned or buried, he wanted his body to fill the belly of a hungry dog. In episode 8 of the show, he said how he ranked cracking your head on a stone lower than being boiled, but higher than being eaten by dogs. The fact that he said to Omi that he wanted his body to be left there to be eaten by dogs, maybe it showed how he viewed himself in the end, not worthy of a burial or a ceremony, and in his own way, maybe he valued his life less than Nagakata, because at least Nagakata was loyal to his father. Plus, Toranaga also said to Yabushige, "Why tell a dead man the future?" when he asked if Toranaga was doing all of this to become shogun. This was something which connected to the fact that Yabushige said those exact words earlier on in the season. Yabushige's arc was one that was rounded off in the most perfect way possible. He'd been loyal to Ishido, but deeply regretted it, and then once back with Toranaga, he was ordered to be killed. Yabushige did this to himself, and he was the catalyst for his own demise. Every step of the way, he was just a perfectly written and performed character. The lack of a battle as the show was building towards the finale, those that know of the real history, the story in the Clavell novel or the 80s miniseries were fully aware of the fact that the infamous Battle of Sekigahara was the very battle that brought an end to Ishido Mitsunari, which is the person that Ishido was based on, and it allowed Ieyasu Tokugawa, the individual that Toranaga was based on, to reign supreme and become shogun. Within the 80s show and the novel, the battle is almost treated as a footnote, and it isn't given lots of time and attention. Back in the 80s miniseries, there was a shot of Toranaga looking on at John Blackthorne as he was rebuilding his ship with the men that were assigned to him, and the mentioning of the Battle of Sekigahara was present. Plus, we also saw Toranaga and his men preparing for the battle, but we didn't see it at all. Just like what happened in this iteration over 40 years later. I was wondering whether or not there would be some kind of void that would be left within me by not seeing the battle taking place in the FX show, considering that there were moments in this show where you could imagine it looking epic. But the fact that they chose to not include it was a really valuable and important decision, not only because it allowed it to stay true to the source material and not putting the value on the battle, but also because if they did include an episode that was solely focused on the Battle of Sekigahara, it would have taken away from the main focus and skills that the show had been centered around Toranaga and the ability that he had to dictate and read the wind. The Battle of Sekigahara is the end. It's not necessarily the be-all and end-all and the moment that everything is building towards. Everything that we saw in this show was important, and I feel if we had a battle, it would have softened the importance of every chess move that Toranaga made. We spent the entirety of this season seeing exactly how Toranaga played those that were his enemies, and those that were closest to him in order to weaken the opposition. Toranaga knew what was going to happen before it did because he could read the wind, and I feel having Lady Ochiban Okada pulling the heir's army out of Sekigahara in the final moment was a brilliant move that embodied the trickery that Toranaga was so masterful at. We didn't need a battle. It would have been nice to have seen one, don't get me wrong, but we sure can imagine what it would have been like. Don't get me wrong as well. I wish we had seen what happened to Ishido because that would have been interesting, seeing him getting his comeuppance, but we saw his weakened state and the fact that he was betrayed on the battlefield in that short section, so I think the lack of a battle actually went in the show's favor. The ambiguous conclusion. Whilst this show ended in a way that wrapped up a lot of the story that we'd been following, I also feel like there was still a lot that was left open, which was done intentionally, and I quite liked it. We saw what was going to be happening in a month's time, which was the Battle of Sekigahara, and we knew that Toranaga was going to win. So rather than the show ending at its final point, where Toranaga became shogun, or where he eventually died after his long reign, we finished this show before the end, and we understood that these characters were going to be continuing in the fight that they had in standing alongside Toranaga. There's not many shows that can land that, because one would just argue that they should continue creating the show if that's the case. But with this, it just worked. The show was all about the planning and preparation, not the outcome or the product. So by it leaving us not seeing him becoming shogun, but knowing that he will eventually go on to be, It leaves it up to our imagination on how the rest of the journey is going to go. And as well, we can also do research on the real historical figures too. I felt the same was also the case with Blackthorne too. He was only at the start of his journey in Japan. Granted, he wasn't permitted to leave because Toranaga wanted him to stay, but we finally saw him at the point of being content with being there. He was conflicted before about which culture he related to, but with him smiling up at Toranaga and being accepted by the people of Japan, he knew that he'd found the place where he now belonged, and I thought that was a great way for the character to conclude. I do genuinely believe that Shogun had the perfect ending, and not only did it have the perfect ending, but it was a pretty faultless show. It's not often that shows like this come around, it's one every few years these days, and the fact that there's not going to be a season 2, it makes it even more bittersweet. Shogun was incredible, and if they do make a prequel or something like that, I'd 100% be open to it. But with regards to this story, I think that it's done, and we just need to leave it for the perfect entity that it is. So there you have it, why Shogun has the perfect ending. If you want to see more videos on Shogun, then click on the card in the top corner. I've been covering the entirety of the show, and I also have a few more videos that I'm working on, so be sure to stick around for them. Do you think Shogun nailed the ending? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. As always, thanks for tuning into the video, and I'll see you in the next one.